Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Fry Day, it's French Fry Day, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Fry Day. It's French Fry Day.
I am not a super fan of Holy Post and its product. I don't believe that they depict the Christian faith, sound, faithful brothers and sisters arguments correctly. I feel like they do, in fact, give cover to sin. They give excuses to people to not obey God in order to continue down a road of progressive Christianity. I was asked to watch the Holy Post's most recent video with Sky Jahani speaking with David French. So I watched the video and I want to react to it. I am going to try my best to get through the entire thing. I might speed it up a little bit. I might cut out a couple portions, but I'll leave the full video, the link in the description below. So I want to go ahead and let's bring this up.
Thanks so much for having me, but we're remote this time.
I know it's not the same as having you in studio, which was a lot of fun. We appreciated your time. We have not really talked since the Dobbs decision about abortion, and we're overdue.
Yeah.
It's time to do that. Let's begin here just to get people up to speed. Not that people aren't aware of what's going on, but remind us about the parameters of the Dobbs decision. It came on a case from Mississippi that was arguing for, was it a 15-week ban on abortion?
Yes, right, exactly. So what happened is, in a nutshell, is that Mississippi passed a ban on abortion after 15 weeks. That was challenged in court because it was incompatible with Casey. There were two key cases prior to Dobbs: Roe v. Wade, which established that the Constitution protects a right to abortion, and then Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which was the 1992 case after Roe v. Wade, that really overturned Roe without overturning the right to an abortion, if that makes sense.
It doesn't. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit because it's a lot of just legalese and such like that. But I do want you to pay attention to, there's some key elements that on this show you will not hear mentioned, and we'll talk about it at the end, but there's some key elements that you will not hear mentioned on this episode at all.
Umbrella, which is known as abortion abolitionism.
Right.
I had not heard that term prior to this year, I think. Although, as I've studied and read up on the perspective, I realized I actually encountered this about 25 years ago for the first time. I just didn't know what to call it. Tell us, what is abortion abolitionism, and juxtapose that with what is sometimes called abortion incrementalism.
Right. And well, I actually don't think those are the two things that are diametrically opposed. I would say the two things that are opposed are abortion abolitionism and the mainstream pro-life movement,
right?
Which includes the concept of incrementalism, but is not, incrementalism isn't the summary of what the mainstream pro-life movement is. So what abortion abolitionism at its essence is saying is that abortion is murder. It should be treated as homicide. It should be treated the way murder is treated under the law. In other words, anyone who's involved in the killing should face prosecution. That any kind of incremental ban or incremental limit on abortion is compromise with the abortion regime. So if you have a 15-week...
Let's stop for a second. Let's stop for a second. What other crime would you want to be allowed to run unfettered, unchecked, without any kind of consequences? Would you want like conspiracy, racketeering? What crime would you want to allow to be not and allow only one person? So let's say there's a conspiracy to steal something, and there's several people in the process, kind of like Ocean's 11. Which one of those people do you not want to prosecute if every one of them was involved in the actual crime? So why would you not want every last one of them to be prosecuted or to be somehow or another apprehended and such of that nature? Why would you not?
a ban, well, that's still permitting abortions up to 15 weeks, which doesn't abolish abortion, which needs to be opposed. So it's opposed to incrementalism. It treats everyone involved in the abortion process as if they're committing the crime of murder.
But are they not? So the getaway driver in a bank robbery, is he not also accomplice to the bank robbery? And God forbid, if a murder happens during the bank robbery, everything gets escalated. So what is different? I don't get it.
It doesn't recognize exceptions. So in some versions of abortion abolitionism, even an abortion to save the life of the mother would be banned, or to protect the physical health of the mother would be banned.
Okay, real quick. He's going to talk about it in a moment, but he's using what I call the defense shield: life of the mother, incest, and rape. He's using the life of the mother argument. But watch this. In a few moments, he is going to give and explain that the vast majority of abortions have nothing to do with the life of the mother. He's going to say it out of his own mouth that the vast majorities have nothing to do with the life of the mother. So why are you even bringing that up, David French? Why?
Certainly in cases of rape or incest. So it's a very dramatic position that essentially says any legal accommodation that allows for continued abortion is to be condemned, and that the taboo in the mainstream pro-life movement that's long existed against advocating for prosecuting women should be removed. Now, there are abolitionists who would say, no, I'm not that extreme, but many abolitionists are. And in fact, there was an SBC, Southern Baptist Convention resolution.
We're going to come back to that in a second. Let's go with some kind of horrible assault. Aren't you an abolitionist to that? Wouldn't you want that to be completely done away with? No way, shape, or form to allow it to exist. If you could write a law or outlaw a particular evil assault activity, wouldn't you be basically an abolitionist to that? You would want that to be done away with. I don't understand this argument, but it's actually going to get worse.
That was passed last year in 2021 that was very close to abolitionism. And here's some of the key language. It says, whereas since 1980, the SBC has passed many resolutions reaffirming the importance of human life at all stages of development, but we have yet to call for the immediate abolition of abortion without exception or compromise. And it says, resolved that the messengers of the SBC meeting in Nashville, Tennessee, do state unequivocally that abortion is murder, and we reject any position that allows for any exceptions to the legal protection of our preborn neighbors. Now, this was watered down a little bit. That essentially says it's rejecting incrementalism alone. But again, here's another thing that it says. Whereas over the past 48 years with 60+ million abortions, traditional pro-life laws, though well-intended, have not established equal protection and justice for the preborn, but on the contrary, appallingly have established incremental regulatory guidelines for when, where, why, and how to obtain legal abortion of innocent preborn children. So that's the Southern Baptist Convention in 2021, and that's when I would say the abolitionist movement really sort of burst forth in a much more prominent way.
Okay, let's back up a minute, and two things. First of all,
so right here, Sky Jahani's going to wax eloquently about the name. Let's talk about it.
It with Dobbs, with the overturning of Roe Casey, abolitionists' point of view actually has gained traction, because now in a state-by-state battle over what the law should be around abortion, they have an opportunity to actually implement what they've been saying for many years. Whereas prior to Dobbs, it was kind of moot, right? You can't do this anywhere in the country because Roe Casey wouldn't allow you to do this. But now that it's actually possible, theoretically, to pass these laws criminalizing abortion and prosecuting women who have them, it feels like I'm bumping into more and more rhetoric around this movement, and I'm finding more and more Christians who are finding it somewhat appealing. Like this makes sense to them. But before that, I want to talk about language a little.
I'm finding it weird that you as a Christian are not finding it appealing. That's what I'm finding weird. But watch this.
A little bit. Because I find it interesting that they chose to brand themselves as abortion abolitionists. I mean, they could have chosen a different word. They could have become abortion prohibitionists, drawing from another bit of American history.
Well, that's got a little bit less cultural resonance than abolition.
That's right. But it makes sense why they would choose abolitionists, because their basic argument has been slavery was an unmitigated evil. And nobody would say we should have an incremental approach to the abolition of slavery. Nobody would say that, well, we should at least allow people to be slaves up until, I don't know, they're 18 years old. I don't know, whatever.
The fact that he's literally he's arguing for why we're abortion abolitionists. I don't understand why he has a problem with that. For the life of me, I don't get it. But let's go.
Compromise with slavery is untenable to the modern mind, hopefully, for most people.
Absolutely.
And their argument is the same should be true of abortion.
Why is
there should be no sanction for this anywhere in our society?
Hello?
Because, in fact, they would argue it's even more evil than slavery because it is murder from their point of view.
Wait. Notice what he said. Is murder from their point of view. Why is it not your point of view, Sky Johnny? Why do you not see it as murder? What do you see it as? Maybe that's a better question. What does Sky Jahani see this as? I see it as murder. Why does he not see it as that?
Talk about, first, let's make their case for them. What is appealing about their argument, and why do you think it is finding more traction with people?
Well, two things I think that are appealing about the argument. One, it has a very, very straight ahead logic to it.
Right.
That, look, if the unborn child is a child of equal value and worth, as a child who's, if it's, a second trimester, it's a child of equal value and worth to a child that's 6 months old, right? Or 6 years old, or a person 50 years old. If they're of equal value and they're of equal, their humanity, they have the same humanity, fundamental humanity, then why would they be treated differently? This is a human being like any other human being, and therefore the law should treat them exactly the same.
Why is that? Okay, that is a case that we make. Why is that something that's so unheard of for you? I don't get it.
So there's a very straight ahead logic to it. The second thing that's very appealing about it, I think, is more of our cultural moment, which really puts a premium on who's going to be who's truly committed, right? So in other words, everyone else is sort of weak. Who's strong? So especially on the right, you're going to have, and some of this is on the left as well, but not about abortion, but, well, about abortion on the other side, but would be, well, wait a minute, everyone else is sort of a squish, everyone else is a little squeamish, everyone else is searching for the world's approval, and we're the real ones. Like, we're the ones who don't care about the world's approval, we're the ones who see the humanity of the unborn child, we're the ones who are really, truly pro-life here, we're the tough ones. So there's a straight-ahead logic to it, and then there's a kind of a cultural right-wing, modern right-wing logic to it, which is, well, we're the ones who are the strongest on this position. We're the least compromising. And there's a lot of sort of, on a bunch of fronts, right? You see this kind of logic unfolding. We're the ones who are really committed to taking the fight to the other side. And this is how you take the fight to the other side. Enough with persuasion, enough with the, this kind, it's about the law, and it's about imposing legal regimes. And so there's a kind of a cultural moment aspect to it, tied to and connected with the straight ahead sort of logic of, the humanity. The
okay. That was a lot that he said there. But I just want to know, why is this an issue only for this side of the argument or this side of the spectrum and so forth? Why is it not yours, David? I don't understand.
So taking those 2 points, the logic of the argument and the cultural moment, is this a case where the pro-life movement finds itself in a situation where it's sort of the dog that caught the car? Meaning, for decades, the rhetoric coming out of the pro-life movement has been, Dr. Seuss, a person is a person no matter how small. The personhood of the unborn child, the personhood of the fetus, the personhood of the embryo. Like, it's a person. And that's been the rhetoric and argument, whether, I don't know if that holds up legally, but it's the popular rhetoric that I've heard for decades. And so now we suddenly find ourselves in a post-Roe Casey legal environment. And it's like, okay, well, you've been saying it's a person. Now the law is opened up. There's a possibility of passing legislation that legally recognizes the personhood of that unborn child. Are you serious or not? And is that part of what's going on here, that their own rhetoric is now being used to push an agenda that most pro-life people are not on board with, criminalizing and prosecuting women, but the logic they built for the last 50 years is now being used against them?
I don't think so. I don't think so. We would not be having this discussion about whether or not it was okay to murder 30-year-old 40-year-old Indian men, we wouldn't have this discussion. It would be case closed. It's murder. Why are we having this discussion?
Well, to an extent, I think. So if you're saying, look, the reason why I'm pro-life, and the reason why I'm pro-life is I believe the unborn child is a distinct human being deserving of protection under the law, then to turn around and say, well, is it or is it not a distinct human being deserving of protection under the law? And that's, so having that turnaround and people confronting you with that, I think is an entirely fair discussion to have. And to the question of, is this the dog that caught the car? To some extent, because a lot of the differences in the pro-life movement that existed before the sort of abolitionist movement really started to have its moment were still there. There was a lot of simmering disagreement about pro-life laws even before Dobbs. So going back to before Dobbs, there was a disagreement in pro-life circles as to whether or not state legislatures should push for things like heartbeat bills, even though they were going to be immediately struck down in the courts. And my position was, I think you should push for heartbeat bills because heartbeat bills and 15-week bans like in Mississippi are incompatible with Roe and Casey. And there was no real way to overrule Roe and Casey unless you pass laws incompatible with Roe and Casey and challenge them up to the Supreme Court. If what you were doing was always passing laws that would restrict abortion, but were not incompatible with Roe and Casey, you weren't going to have the case that could overturn them. And so there was a combination play at once of both incremental laws that were being passed, like things like, say, waiting periods or ultrasound laws, or laws regulating abortion clinics and admitting privileges laws, saying that doctors and abortion clinics had to have admitting privileges to a local hospital. Those were all very incremental changes. But simultaneously, two tracks were being pursued at once. And I was on both tracks. I was yes to incrementalism, yes to heartbeat bills, in the hopes of confronting the Supreme Court with the reality that a big chunk of America was, through the democratic process, recognizing the humanity of the unborn child. And there was that Roe and Casey rested on completely bogus constitutional grounds. Once the Supreme Court says, you're right, Roe and Casey were rested on bogus constitutional grounds, then you no longer really have that ability to necessarily be on both tracks at once, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so it was natural that you would begin to have some of these divisions break out in the pro-life movement because they were always there. It's just that they weren't particularly salient because Roe and Casey were the law of the land.
Okay, I agree. I think those are some great points. However, my big pushback to this discussion is that, and you're going to notice it throughout this video, is they don't talk about whether, they're not arguing whether or not this is a biblical case or what, they're not arguing and even letting you know where they stand biblically. This could be a Tuesday talking head case just as much as a Sunday talking head case. Nobody's referencing what scripture actually teaches and why we should stand on this. And it's not just because it's a legal issue and whatnot, but why we believe that this is wrong. I don't think they're making that case at all.
Couple things. A few weeks ago, I wanted to study the abolitionist point of view and understand it better and read up on it. And so I go to the source of all truth, and that's Twitter. I put a poll up on my Twitter feed just asking, hey, if you consider yourself pro-life, do you believe, and you consider yourself pro-life and you believe that, an unborn child is actually human and a person and all that, do you believe that women who have abortion should be prosecuted? 80% said no. These are pro-life people.
I just want to stop real quick. Just real quick. I'm going to let you finish, Sky. Why does he not believe that? Notice what he said. I'm going to back up just a little smidge and let him.
Do you believe that women who have abortion should be prosecuted? 80% said no. These are.
Okay, so why does he not believe? He said, back up just a smidgen.
I put a poll up on my Twitter feed just asking, hey, if you consider yourself pro-life, do you believe, and you consider yourself pro-life and you believe that is actually human and a person and all that, an unborn child is actually human and a person and all that.
An unborn child is a human and a person and all that. Did you hear how dismissive he sounds about that idea? Why does he not believe that? I understand you're asking the Twitterverse, but do you believe that Sky Jahani believes that an unborn child is a human, a person? Do you think he believes that?
Is actually human and a person and all that.
Because it sure doesn't sound like it. I'm just saying, but let's go.
Do you believe that women who have abortion should be prosecuted? 80% said no. These are pro-life people. 80% say no, they don't believe they should be prosecuted. 7% said yes, they should be prosecuted. And I believe 12% said they weren't sure. And of the people who said, yes, they should be prosecuted, I asked them why. Like, give me the argument for the abolitionist point of view. And some of them sent me articles and resources, and I started reading up on it. And one of the arguments that came up over and over and over again was the incrementalist approach, the general posture of the pro-life movement, the majority of the pro-life movement, they say, is not actually trying to ban abortion. They're just trying to regulate it. So even the 15-week ban from Mississippi that led to the Dobbs decision really wasn't banning abortion, it was just regulating it. Or parental notification bills or fetal heartbeat bills, all these kinds of things are just regulating. It's not banning. And they see that as compromise with evil. And the other argument that came up a lot, and I know you've written about this, is...
But that's it, though. No, I really feel like they're dancing around the clear reason why most people who are pro-life, abortion abolitionists, however you want to phrase it, is because it's a biblical, spiritual reason. It's not just what, and I feel like David French and Scott Johanna are going to dance around that the whole night. But I'll let them finish.
The general posture from the majority of the pro-life movement is that there are two victims in any abortion. There's the child, but the mother herself is also a victim, and therefore shouldn't be seen as a perpetrator to be prosecuted, but to be cared for as someone who's been hurt in this process as well. And the abolitionist movement basically says that's ridiculous. There are not, right, it's infantilizing to treat these women as if they're too stupid and ignorant.
We can have both and. We can say, hey, they're victims. If a victim of sexual abuse abuses, that person is still, they were a victim and they are a victimizer. They are a perpetrator.
To know what the decision was that they made. How do you respond to that, this infantilizing of women by saying they're victims also in the abortion decision?
Yeah, so I have a couple pronged response here. One is, and this is something that there's a really a great piece, a great book by Francis Beckwith, a book called Defending Life, and he has a part of the book that talks about this issue, and I think it's done very well. And he says those folks who are wanting to craft laws on abortion should take into consideration a few facts. One, unborn human beings are full-fledged members of the human community, and to kill them with no justification is unjustified homicide. Two, because of a general lack of understanding of the true nature of the unborn child, likely due to decades of cultural saturation by abortion choice rhetoric and little serious philosophical reflection on the pro-life position by the general public, most citizens who procure abortions do so out of well-meaning ignorance, which I think is a very important philosophical point under the law. And I think that's something that has to be wrestled with in any just law. And number three, the woman who will seek and obtain an illegal abortion is really a second victim. Women who seek illegal abortion will probably do so out of desperation. Not all of them.
And please keep in mind, now he's discussing the three-pronged defense mechanism: rape, incest, life of the mother. Look at what he's saying. He's literally saying that that's not the reason why women have abortions.
Not all of them. And it says, not realizing at the time of the abortion that the procedure kills a real human being. And you say, oh, that's infantilizing, that's infantilizing. But wait, let's back up. How many times have you had an argument or a discussion with somebody who is pro-choice where they present a lot of good faith arguments that especially first trimester, and sometimes moving into second trimester, fetus, unborn child, shouldn't be and is not in fact exactly the same as a 6-month-old. Shouldn't be treated as and is not in fact exactly the same as a 6-month-old. And they'll bring up, history and tradition such as treating pregnancy and abortion shouldn't be, was really only prohibited after quickening, for example, the sort of the knowledge of the movement of the baby. So there's a lot of argument over the status, especially of the early term unborn child. A lot of argument over that status. And so it's not the same thing as sort of saying about a 6-month-old or 6-year-old. There's no argument in America over the status of a 6-month-old and 6-year-old. There's no good faith disagreement over that. And so in many ways, if you're talking about what is the law supposed to deal with when you're talking about murder statutes, and let's be really clear about what murder is. So murder is deemed typically as the intentional, unjustified killing of a human being. Okay. So you have intent to kill a human being, right? Well, if the intent element is not present, in other words, that there is certainly an intent to have an abortion, but an intent to kill a human being is not present, then under traditional understandings of murder, for example, you don't prosecute somebody for murder under those circumstances. And so if we're in a country and a society where there is widespread disagreement over the legal status of the unborn child, then the imposition of a murder regime that treats the unborn child as if the societal understanding is the same as a 6-month-old or a 6-year-old would be unjust. Okay, so that's one part of it.
Can I interject here?
Yeah, I'm going to real quick jump into Sky. Hold tight. It doesn't matter. I think I understand there's legal implications, but I'm just finding it so troubling that Christians will not argue that this is in fact a wrong law, a wrong way to look at it. So just because society and culture has muddied up the water, we can't see clearly, is what you're saying? That can't be true.
Sure, because there's a lot to take in. All right, couple things. Number one, you know this, I'm not an abolitionist on this topic. So I'm trying to play devil's advocate with their arguments, and I know you're going to bat them down. But here's the thing. You're right. Murder is about intent. There are other things you can be prosecuted for, like manslaughter, which is not about intent. And then, but the other issue here is, why should we treat an entire class of people, meaning women who've had abortions, under the same umbrella of ambiguity, of ignorance, of not actually having intent, when we wouldn't do that with any other large group of people who have committed homicide, right? The taking of a human life. Normally, there's a case to be made where prosecutors look at an individual case, they look at the evidence of intent, and then they decide, is this murder? Is this manslaughter? Was this an accidental homicide? Whatever it might be, and you prosecute based on what's discovered. Why not take that same approach with abortion, where rather than saying everyone who's had an abortion, none of them are guilty of murder, none of them are guilty of, whatever the crime might be, they're all in this category of ignorant, perhaps even well-intentioned decision that shouldn't be prosecuted. And in the I keep saying abolitionists rather than abolitionists. Some are saying, yeah, we should prosecute for flat out murder with all these cases. Others are saying, maybe it's not murder. In other words, they're not put behind bars for life or capital punishment or some other heinous punishment, but why not criminalize it and have some kind of prosecution where there is a penalty for this, even if it's not the same as murder one?
Well,
okay, that's a great, I understand Sky Jahani is not an abolitionist. However, his argument, that's a great question. So let's hear what David French does with that, because I think that is really part of the question. I don't know what it might need to be. And maybe it doesn't need to be murder one. Maybe it could be manslaughter. I don't know. Maybe it could be reckless manslaughter. I don't know. There's several categories that it could go in. The problem is we're not even there to the point of arguing the categories that what's going to happen to a doctor, what's going to happen to a woman that participates in this action. We're not even there yet. So let's get there. Let's at least agree, Christians, that this is a bad practice. It's evil. It's wrong. Now, how we deal with it judicially, we can do that. But at least we can say it's bad, it's wrong. We don't need to do it. Let's see what he says.
Most states that ban abortion, that are not banning abortion under an abolitionist regime, do in fact have criminal penalties for an unlawful abortion.
On the woman.
Not on the woman.
Well, that's the point, though. Right. I mean, there's been a lot of rhetoric around prosecuting the physicians and others who aid in it from a medical point of view. Why not prosecute the woman?
Yeah, but, so the question there is, and then again, you get to second phase of what I was going to talk about. So phase number one is the mens rea issue, that as Beckwith notes, the idea that people are engaging in the intentional killing of a person that they know to be a human being of the same value worth as somebody who's 6 months old, 6 years old, whatever, just is absent. Okay. Then the second part of this, which I think is really important, is what do we know about why people get abortions? Okay, what is it that we know about this? And this is something that's not been sufficiently studied, to be honest. It's been studied. It's not been sufficiently studied. The abortion issue, a lot of the survey.
So when he pulls this out, he's going to pull out his hat. Why do women get abortions? Now, remember before it was rape, incest, life of the mother.
And the polling data and all of this around abortion is quite frankly often trash. Abortion polling by and large has got a lot of problems. But
I'm sure my Twitter poll was very scientifically accurate.
No, that was the gold standard.
I'm sure.
But if you're talking about actually taking a look at to why people get abortions, there's this tremendous study by Tricia Bruce at Notre Dame from a couple of years ago, where what she did is she brought hundreds of people in, demographically representative, and rather than just simply asking them a series of questions about, say, trimesters or do you call yourself pro-life or pro-choice, she asked them to talk about abortion and to sort of get their feelings. And what she found was, as a political matter, her sample broke down kind of like the way the polling samples do. A minority are very pro-life and would ban all or most abortions. Another minority are very pro-choice and would permit abortion all the way up till birth. A big group in the middle had a discomfort. At some point they would say no, whether it was 6 weeks or 15 weeks or 20 weeks, they would say no. But what was interesting is that she found of all of the people that were interviewed, none of them, not even the most pro-choice, would label abortion as a desirable good.
Mm-hmm.
None of them.
Right. I remember that.
So, yeah, it's really fascinating. So why do people get abortions? Relationship stress. In other words, they have an abusive boyfriend, or
that's not life of the mother.
They have an abusive husband, or the boyfriend bailed, or the husband bailed.
That's not incest.
So relationship instability, financial instability.
That's not
all
incest.
Of these things, a sense of uncertainty, instability.
That's not rape.
Are things that play into the decision whether or not to abort. And this is where we're getting to this idea of the woman as also a victim of the process.
That's why we said that she's not a victim of the process, because a victim of the process would be she was taken advantage of and rape happened, or her true life is in danger. That would be the case. That's not the case here, David French. That's not the case. You literally just said relational stress is the reason why women get abortion. That's not any of those three that you said before. I'm just making a point.
So, is the woman, under what circumstances has the father bailed? Has that have they lost a job is like some of my classmates in high school or their parents telling them to get an abortion or they'll be thrown out of the house.
Those are all sins.
And so, yeah.
Those are all sins. David French and Sky Jahani, those are sins. So why are we not calling it what it is? But again, we don't compound sin. So because a sin was inflicted upon you, you commit another sin to make the first sin go away?
Come on, David. Like, I mean, I'm with you. Again, I'm trying to play devil's advocate here. Why not take those things into consideration on a case-by-case basis in the process of prosecution? Why not? I mean, we would do this with anyone who's being accused.
They're bogging this thing down because keep in mind, we're not even to that, how to charge somebody, how to charge a doctor, how to charge a woman with a crime. They're already there. We haven't even gotten there yet. So like, I'm like, calm down, my friend. I understand you're hot to trot to put somebody in jail, but let's slow down and get the matter resolved properly, which is first things first. Abortion is wrong. Like, let's just do that first before you jump in, because you're jumping out the window to do all this other stuff and you haven't even addressed the main issue
of murder or manslaughter or whatever, and you come and you realize, well, she killed her husband because he was beating her every day, and there's these circumstances where it was in self-defense, right. And you go, okay, but we wouldn't just say anybody who's taken a human life, there had to be extreme circumstances. We're just not even going to bother to pass a law and prosecute anybody. I mean, that's what the abolitionist side is saying here is, no, let's have the default be, you've taken a human life, and that needs to be seen and protected, and right. Equal justice comes up a ton in their arguments.
And we just need to say that, like, just say that part. We want that to be the case. Like, hey, this is a human life, period. Now we'll deal with what to do, but at least let's move ourselves to that point. We're not even there. We're still arguing about whether or not it's a lump of cells or whatever.
If there are mitigating circumstances in a particular case of abortion, that should be considered, but that's the exception, not the rule.
So already we've established that a large percentage of these people do not have the mens rea. We've also established that a large number of these people are operating under a degree of duress. So then we get to the point you're saying, okay, well, let's just go ahead and establish that there is a mens rea. Let's grant that a bunch of them don't have the necessary mens rea, the state of mind. Let's go ahead and establish that a bunch of folks are under duress. Still, we should get the state in the business of determining who has received an abortion, filing charges, and then allowing you to present these things as some kind of affirmative defense. Well, then now you start to get into this notion of, okay, what state apparatus here are you actually wanting to create?
Right.
All right. He's about to go right here and start talking about how much of a bureaucratic boondoggle this is going to be, which, I mean, I can totally understand his point. The only thing is, David French didn't say this when he was supporting reparations, or maybe he did. Maybe he did. Find me a clip, link down below, or tag me to it, where he spoke against reparations with the same level of, well, it's going to be a bureaucratic deluge, a bureaucratic boondoggle, and we don't want to do it because it's just not going to be bureaucratically sound to do. Let me know.
And this is the part that I think is almost laughable, because if you were to pass such laws, they're virtually impossible to enforce.
Right.
But did you say that about
So what is the state apparatus here that you're wanting to create? So you've got here's the conceptual issue, mens rea. Here's another moral issue, duress. And then you have a practical issue, which also turns into a moral issue of the state apparatus necessary to survey the world of American pregnancies, determine who's been pregnant, who lost the pregnancy, and if they lost the pregnancy, was it a natural miscarriage or was it an abortion?
Right.
So you're talking about a dramatic expansion of state power aimed at prosecuting what we already know to be a population of people who disproportionately don't have the mens rea and are disproportionately under duress. And so what you then end up.
So I just wonder, did he say this exact same thing about reparations? I don't think so. I don't think Sky said it either. They were if I'm not mistaken, they were extremely for the notion of reparations. But that's going to be a bureaucratic boondoggle. Who was brought here as slaves? Who were brought here as immigrants? Who came here as immigrants? Who came from a lot of slave owners? It's the exact same thing. It's going to be a bureaucratic mess. But did they shoot that down? I just wonder.
With is a situation that becomes an overpowering instrument of state enforcement and state intrusion that begins to have its own justice issues just in the creation and execution of it.
But David, you are making a pragmatic argument, and the abolitionists are making a principled argument.
No, it's pragmatic and principled. So
tell me
principle mens rea, principle and pragmatism, the duress, and then it's also pragmatism and principle when you're coming to the creation of immense, intrusive state law enforcement authorities.
Did he say that during the pandemic? Can somebody send me a link of David French saying that this is too much bureaucratic law enforcement to lock down churches and schools and businesses and gyms, parks? It's too much. Let me know.
Because one of the things that we know is that there are justice issues that arise when you create immense state and federal law enforcement regimes. They follow like night follows day. It is not simply the case that you create a giant intrusive state enforcement regime and justice then follows. That's not the way we know that the world works.
So again, let me know, because David French, I don't think that you were saying that exact same thing, singing that exact same song during the pandemic. I could be wrong, but I don't think you were. I don't think Scott Jahani was saying, hey, reparations is not pragmatic. I don't think so. Let me know.
There are ways in which a just society can, by law, protect human life, including by regulating the availability of abortion resources and limiting the availability and prohibiting the availability, or, for example, closing clinics or prohibiting the dissemination of abortion pills. Those things are much more aimed at the supply side, much more available to law enforcement with existing resources, many fewer issues regarding expansion of state surveillance and state authority. It's much more targeted at where abortions actually take place. Does not involve a dramatic expansion of the prison industrial complex, so to speak. And so there is a different way of looking at this that is not either one of those extremes. But Sky, and here's what's really important. I think the smart folks in the pro-life movement know something very important. They know that law, even if law bans abortion, law cannot end abortion. And the real point of the pro-life movement is to end abortion. Okay.
We'll come back to that in a minute, because that's also why I share your point of view.
I agree. We realize that you're not going to legalize morality, but taking that off the table is key. Like there's no reason to get into the moral discussion about why a woman finds herself in a position of needing abortion, if in fact abortion is free and available. You can go through the drive-through at this point. So I don't think that, I agree. Like, we understand it's not going to do away with it completely, but we know that having a free and unfettered access is not a good thing either.
Because in the end, I want to see abortions ended, and I know there's only so much the legal system can do.
Hey, so when I was recording this video, it was really late. It was well past my bedtime. And what Jahani said just went right over my head. What David French said just went right over my head. They both say they want to see abortion ended. Well, doesn't it mean that you're an abolitionist to it? Like, I don't understand why are we even splitting hairs? Why are you even trying to split hairs? Abolitionists, incrementalists, like, let's get this thing together that we all want the process to end. Now, mind you, some people want it to end right now today. Some people want it to end 10 years from now. We're going to come together. We're going to figure it out. We're going to get it to end in 5 years. We'll split the difference. But the idea, the notion that, well, because you want it to end completely right now, and because I want it to end in 10 years, 15 years, well, yeah, we can't get together. That's just so silly. They literally said it.
Okay, two other arguments that I have encountered from the abolitionist side, and they're arguments that are targeting the majority pro-life movement and pointing out what is perceived to be hypocrisy on the majority pro-life movement side. Two things. Number one article I read was really interesting, and they surveyed a bunch of pro-life literature, especially from religious groups like Roman Catholic pro-life groups. In fact, the ERLC, the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And what they found in a lot of their pro-life literature was this idea that women who have abortions should be cared for, and they need counseling or help or various other things after having gone through an abortion. But many of them mention the fact that these women feel enormous guilt and need forgiveness. Some even going so far as to argue that they have cooperated with an evil system and do carry culpability and guilt for that and should seek God's forgiveness. And the point of view of the abolitionist folks is that, well, if they're guilty of sin and you're calling for forgiveness, then clearly there's something here that should be picked up by the criminal justice system, because if they're truly innocent victims and were ignorant of what they had done, then why so much guilt? Because sin that's done in ignorance usually doesn't require or necessarily bring about a guilty conscience and a need for forgiveness.
Well, I mean, okay, so there's a couple of responses to that. One, the idea that I might need forgiveness for something does not then therefore translate into that thing should also be illegal.
Right. But they would argue this is the taking of a human life.
Right. But then we're right back to...
Because we are going to be right back in the exact same spot without really making any progress or headway. I don't think we should say, just because you feel guilt, it should be illegal. However, I think it's an acknowledgement that there's a sin there, which I think Sky Johnny just kind of ignores. He does not acknowledge that, yeah, the reason you feel guilt is because you violated God's law. You violated God, which is where guilt should come from. But let's continue.
The original conversation that we started to have.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the feelings of pain are not related to, and I don't know how many folks have spent time with, in crisis pregnancy centers and dealing with folks who spend a lot of time working in crisis pregnancy centers. That sort of feeling of remorse or pain that flows from an abortion, you can't always categorize it as, well, I know I killed a living baby. It can be also categorized as, I stopped this potential life, to use the language of Roe, or what could this fetus have been? Or I have tremendous regret that I listened to a boyfriend who was going to leave anyway, or I can't believe my parents in a fit of shame pressed me to do this. These are lots of different complicated feelings other than, I know I killed a baby, who's just the same as a 6-month-old.
If you feel guilty about something, like you're not feeling guilty because you ran over a squirrel on the way to Dunkin' Donuts in the morning. It's not the same thing. You might be like, oh man, try to avoid him and hit him, but you're not feeling guilty about it. And I'm sorry, I just think David French is really minimizing the fact that a sin has been committed, but it is what it is.
6-year-old. So consciousness of that something terrible happened is not the same thing as a acknowledgement of murder or homicide.
Wait, hold on. Acknowledgement of something terrible is not the same as admitting murder or homicide. What are you saying? What is the something terrible then, sir? What is the terrible thing? That one is that's some word salad right there.
If that makes sense.
No, okay. Then the other argument they make, and I've heard you make this argument in some of what you've written, is that rather than criminalizing this and putting women in jail and prosecuting them, what we need is greater education. We need more of a cultural movement that values life, that instructs people about the value of the unborn child and those kinds of things. The abolitionist movement comes back and says, well, in a weird way, that makes their culpability greater, because the more aware people become of the human life that is within them in this fetal form, and the more they recognize it as a person and as a human life, then they can't plead ignorance anymore when they still decide to abort that child. So in a way, is the pro-life movement talking out of both sides of its mouth because it wants to inform and educate more people, but doesn't that raise the culpability for those who still then have an abortion?
I guess at some point are you then saying, wait a minute, you could not be prosecuted unless you have an ultrasound. And then the instant you have an ultrasound, you can be prosecuted. I can think of a few better ways to prevent people from having an ultrasound than maybe that's criminal legal liability.
Oh, I'm not certain I even understand what you mean. No, we want you to know that you're killing a baby. But I think education, they're using that word education really loosey-goosey. It's not just education. We want you to know that you're violating God's law. And we want you to understand and honor and respect God's law and not break his law. That's what we want. It's not just education for education's sake. It's not just a biological understanding, or it's not just a bunch of information. Because I'm sorry, I don't believe that it's an education issue. I am not under the delusion that these women and men that support this heinous practice don't realize they're killing a human. I don't actually think that's the case. I think the case is that they don't care. Explanation and the preaching and the continuing placarding of Christ before them is what's needed. So, yeah, I don't think that that's the case at all, actually, but let's go.
If you can prove that people have encountered scientific literature that speaks about a 6-week, 15-week-old fetus as being fully human, right, then they're culpable, right? They know what it is they are doing.
We're already culpable.
That they've heard one side of an argument makes them culpable. It's again,
if a doctor is forced to inform them before a procedure, hey, or when they find out they're pregnant, right, if the literature, all that is reinforces this is a human life and has equal protection under whatever the argument is, there are ways to make people aware of the decisions they are making.
Right, of course. And that's part of the reason for informed consent laws, for example, to try to make people think twice, to give people information to cause them to think twice. And So that's part of the whole goal of persuasion. If the abolitionist argument is then, but then you cannot, so there's always when you're thinking about law, you're thinking about two things at once. You're thinking about principle and pragmatism, because the way the law actually works, sometimes it becomes difficult to separate out principle and pragmatism. So,
okay.
This is what I always end up doing when I'm talking to sort of my friends on the more authoritarian right, is I ask, have you thought through the implications here? Right. Mm-hmm. So have you thought through the implications that if I expose more people to the argument that I'm making, when there are counter arguments that other people in good faith are making, if I expose more people to the argument that I'm making, the more they're exposed to my argument, there's an escalating criminal responsibility that's attached to it.
That same thing can be said about scripture and about the gospel. The more I preach the gospel to you, the more likely that if you're a hardened heart and you've already rejected Christ in your heart, that your heart will continue to get harder. There's a high probability, however, that the Holy Spirit might very well take your stony heart and regenerate that joker into a heart of flesh. It is 100% possible. We don't stop preaching, though. That's the thing. We don't stop preaching. We continue to preach because we know that the effectual working of the Holy Spirit will empower the gospel to do what he intended for it to do. So we don't stop preaching the gospel. It's like we don't stop telling people that you are murdering babies. Just saying.
Just think that through as far as the actual pragmatic results of that kind of environment. And at that point, when the pragmatic results mean people obtaining less information, and with less information, perhaps more abortions, then I'm not sure that there's the principled basis left for the position. So, one of the things I think is really, really, really important here is if we are talking about ending abortion, we have to be talking about mainly persuasion. Mainly persuasion. Okay.
And what would be the most persuasive argument to give to a man and a woman, or a woman a man and woman that are fornicating, that are in adulterous relationships, a woman that is in a position where she needs an abortion? What would be the most persuasive message we could give them? I wonder.
For a couple of reasons. One, it takes persuasion to pass laws, right? So we don't have monarchs. You might have a few very, very, very red states that already have very low abortion rates where you could pass a more abolitionist regime. But if you're going to deal...
I do think also, I don't know, I'm bothered by the fact that he keeps saying regime. I don't know why. I don't like that. But wait. I like how the enemies are the red states, not the blue states that are having unequivocal, unfettered murder of babies.
With abortion in the United States writ large, you still have to persuade an awful lot of people to your point of view. And then the other thing to...
No, we remove that option off the table, because the vast majority of these, as he has already said, are not because of rape, incest, or life of the mother. They are out of convenience. So we remove that option off the table, and then we deal with those issues. A lot of people don't. It's a form of birth control. It's not just, I've caught myself in a bad situation. No, it's really, I'm not concerned about it. I'm gonna go get an abortion. Yeah, I don't care. I'm just gonna go get an abortion. That is a whole different game.
Realizes that when laws are easily evaded, okay, this is one thing that we have learned throughout American history. When laws are easily evaded in the absence of cultural change, you cannot end, and sometimes you can't even meaningfully diminish the practice that you seek to ban. So, we're now in this re-reckoning as we go through every decade or so about, for example, the war on drugs. Very, very, very easily evaded. Prohibitions against the use of illicit drugs, very, very easily evaded. And the comprehensive, massive law enforcement response that we've mobilized to deal with these easily evaded laws have had their own massive consequences in society. And so at some point you say, has the cost yielded the benefit that we wanted? And we have to really think hard about that, even if you are, as I am, of the belief that the use of illicit drugs is incredibly dangerous and destructive and unhealthy and unwise. You have to think about these costs and these benefits.
I think the war on drugs was a bad war. Everything that we've had a war on, we've called a war on, has always gotten done better. War on drugs, whatever the war is that we declare, usually doesn't go well. I personally think that was flawed from the start. It was slated to fail, simply because we weren't dealing with the issue. There's a heart issue. We're trying to legislate morality, is what David French and Scott Jahani are discussing here. We're trying to legislate morality, and we recognize that people are immoral. So the only way to deal with their immoral is, we're not going to deal with the fruit of their immorality. We have to deal with their immoral hearts, and that's through the gospel, sir. That's through the preaching of the gospel. Now, on the same note, we try to remove some of these evil practices that allow for somebody to injure and harm themselves, injure and harm others, as well as an unborn child. But at the end of the day, it's the unfettered, wicked heart that we're dealing with. That's where the gospel comes in. And as two professing Christians on this show right here, they have yet to give the solution that will fix the abortion issue, which is the gospel.
And so one of the things that it's very important for people to remember is all the way back in 1973, according to the best data that we have, when abortion was mostly illegal in the US, we had a higher abortion rate than we have now. Right. A higher abortion rate. That should be very sobering to folks who think you can just pass laws. So I think laws should be just.
So what should we do, Mr. French? I would love to hear, what should we do? If you believe that unfettered, because again, at the end of the day, this is an incrementalist argument. Whereas somebody might say we should do away with the whole entire practice completely. Somebody else might say, no, we should be able to do drive-through abortions. And David French and Scott Jahani are really in the middle, just kind of like, well, you guys, you don't need to be that strict about it. Just, we're going to reduce it by 10. But over here, they're slamming on the gas to increase it by 1,000. So I don't see what the purpose of this discussion is, truthfully, except to make abolitionists look like troglodytes or something.
And I think there should be cultural reform. And both of those things require an avalanche of persuasion into the culture.
What's
and this idea that you can just sort of short circuit that by passing laws, how, without persuasion?
What will persuade the culture?
And dramatically expanding the scope and reach of the state to achieve the ends you want to achieve. I think that's deeply misguided.
So to begin to wrap up this part of the conversation, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this and the reason I've been intrigued by this abolitionist movement is I'm seeing more and more rhetoric this way on social media to the point where
sure on Twitter. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely on Twitter, to the point where if you just hold to the mainstream pro-life position, which I would say you do and I do, I'm being called pro-choice because I'm not a squish because I'm not an abolitionist, because I believe an exception should be made for a woman whose life is at risk. And I believe that putting women behind bars and prosecuting them is not actually going to have the effect people want.
Okay, that's fine. But why? The issue that I keep bringing up is that this crowd refuses to even concede that this idea of the idea of abolishing that practice is a good thing. They're only coming from a pragmatic standpoint. Well, it's going to be too much bureaucracy and it's not going to really work. You see what the war on drugs did and such like that. Not God's word actually says, thou shalt not murder.
So my concern is that that's going to grow more and more for various reasons, that the consistent celebrated Christian position is going to be the abolitionist position. And I fear for that. But there's two other things here. You mentioned one of them already. And that is before 1973, yeah, the abortion rate was higher. But the other thing people forget is there was no abortion abolitionist movement.
Wait. Why is that a bad thing? I don't get it. For the life of me, I'm sorry. I just refuse to believe these people are fighting for our team. I refuse to believe it. Why is that a bad thing? Like, you're making it sound like, okay, fine, I will concede that throwing women in jail, it might be a little bit harsh. I got you. We can definitely clear that one up. And I think there should be some room to navigate that one. However, you're worrying about the after effect when I'm discussing the crime itself. Let's stop people from killing babies. Like, why is that a complex idea? For the life of me, I don't understand why you can't see that as, okay, if a woman, like, we're not arguing about what would happen if somebody robbed a bank. You cannot rob banks. We're not sitting here lamenting and rubbing our hands about, well, what if somebody robs a bank? What if somebody speeds. We're not doing that. We're just laying the law down. We're keeping it moving. Why is that a problem? I don't understand.
Before very recently, there was none. There was no movement to prosecute women who got abortions before Roe v. Wade. And go back through history, through Christian history, there's never been a movement to prosecute women who've had abortions. And so if that's the case over 2,000 years of Christian history, and suddenly...
The only time he uses Christian is to beat us over the head and say, well, you see Christian history doesn't say this. Well, we haven't done this in Christian history. That's the only time he's used Christian in this entire discussion.
Some Christians are making this the cause to fight for. You got to ask yourself, what do we think now about pregnancy that we didn't think 100 years ago or 200 years ago? And then finally, to your point that you made earlier, if you really do believe in the abolitionist logic, what it would require as far as government bureaucracy to actually legislate and enforce this is absurd and ridiculous.
Yeah.
And all that leads me to this place of, a pregnancy is such a unique condition in that, I mean, not unique and rare. A lot of women are pregnant all the time, but it's something that is so powerful and intimate where two people, a mother and a child, are intimately interdependent with one another in a way that the government can't see, the law can't see, the outside world can't see, but God can. And so what happens between that unborn child and that mother, to some extent, is beyond our scope to legislate. And a conscience before God is, I mean, that's the unique thing about motherhood, is they have this intimacy and this connection with another person that as a man, I'll never know. And yet God is involved in that in some way. And don't we have to leave space for that to be the regulating factor? And then our role simply becomes, how do we cultivate a culture in which that is both celebrated and affirmed, and hopefully creates a culture of life rather than just law and prosecution?
You are giving space to the murdering of a child. And you literally are saying that it's this intimate, interrelated relationship between a mother and child, and God has brought them together. All that's beautiful. But then you're like, let a woman murder her baby. And if her conscience don't bother her, then keep it moving. Come on, Sky. Come on. Good gravy.
One of the things, there's many things we can do to create and help celebrate a culture of life. And some things we've been doing actually pretty well as a pro-life movement. Because remember, the abortion rate peaked about 80, 81. And for 40 years, almost 40 years, it declined until the Trump administration, when it increased. Trump was the first president that the abortion rate increased under since Jimmy Carter. Okay, so we can have that discussion at some point. But for about 36 years, the abortion rate is heading down. Well, there are many reasons for that, many different reasons. But a couple of them include, one, I think the church has done a much better job at...
Okay, I'm going to let him finish that up. I'm sorry, man. How you going to bring Trump into this, dude? Y'all wild. Y'all are wild. How's that got to do anything with Jimmy or Donald? What does that got to do with anything? It's people, man. People doing sinful stuff.
What happens between that unborn child and that mother, to some extent, is beyond our scope to legislate. And a conscience before God is, I mean, that's the unique thing about motherhood, is they have this intimacy and this connection with another person that as a man, I'll never know. And yet God is involved in that in some way. And don't we have to leave space for that to be the regulating factor? And then our role simply becomes, how do we cultivate a culture in which that is both celebrated and affirmed, and hopefully creates a culture of life rather than just law and prosecution?
One of the things, there's many things we can do to create and help celebrate a culture of life. And some things we've been doing actually pretty well as a pro-life movement. Because remember, the abortion rate peaked about 80, 81. And for 40 years, almost 40 years, it declined until the Trump administration, when it increased. Trump was the first president that the abortion rate increased under since Jimmy Carter. Okay, so we can have that discussion at some point. But for about 36 years, the abortion rate is heading down. Well, there are many reasons for that, many different reasons. But a couple of them include, one, I think the church has done a much better job at destigmatizing unwed pregnancy. So I have a good friend in California pro-life leader in California, who says we need to treat every pregnancy as a blessing. And that's a change from even when I was in high school, when Christian girls I knew got pregnant and they felt like it was the end for them. They were going to be excluded from their Christian school. They were going to be thrown out of the house. And I think a lot of that has changed, and that's helped. And a lot of the data says that more unplanned pregnancies are being carried to term than used to be, which I think is a tribute to cultural change. But there's also some policy change. I love what Elizabeth Brunig wrote in The Atlantic. She said, make every birth free in the United States of America. If you're pregnant, you can give birth to your baby and you don't have to pay a dime.
Which sounds profoundly pro-life.
Very. Here's another one. The Mitt Romney child allowance plan begins prenatally. Okay, prenatally.
Wait, it's a bureaucratic boondoggle to say that we are going to prosecute those who have abortions. But it's not. It's perfectly okay to say that every birth should be free in the United States. That's not a bureaucratic machine at all. There's no, you can just do that and nothing's going to change. There's not going to be any ramification or anything like that.
Every person about 3-4 months, but I can't remember the exact number, about 3 or 4 months before they give birth, they start getting that child allowance, which helps them prepare financially for the birth of the child. And if we know why people get abortions, well, one thing we know is they get abortions because of deep and profound financial stress. And that Mitt Romney child allowance plan would do an enormous amount to eliminate, not entirely, but to alleviate dramatically child poverty in the United States.
Through the government. That's yet another government bureaucracy. But I guess it's not going to, it doesn't take anything though. It's not going to be, there's not going to be any interference. You're not going to find out if the woman is pregnant. You're not going to worry about ultrasounds. You're not, what happens if she has a miscarriage right before the birth? Anything like that. She's been getting this money. Nope. None of that's going to have to worry about that. Don't worry about that. Just, it's good. Gotcha, David. Gotcha. Good.
So these are two things. And the Mitt Romney plan's actually revenue neutral. It pulls money from, it takes money from other programs and puts it here. So it's not an addition to the deficit. So I think, we need to be thinking creatively along those lines about.
Notice his thinking creatively started with government. There was nothing except the church needs to celebrate it. Church needs to celebrate unwed mothers, but that's it. That's it. Everything else is governmental.
Creating that culture of life. Okay, can we talk about Herschel Walker for just a minute?
If we have to.
No, we have to. So the abortion abolitionist position, right, is that he committed murder for hire.
Right. I actually have heard that. Sure.
That is the abortion abolitionist movement, that he committed murder for hire. Yep. But their argument is vote for him anyway. Okay. Vote for him anyway, even though he committed murder for hire. But here's my question. Would they make the same argument if he had hired his girlfriend to kill a 6-year-old? Right? He could. I don't think that they would. And one of the problems that I have with a lot of this is that when the rubber meets the road, how much of this is Twitter rhetoric? Yeah. Versus how much of this is, I have a principle that I'm going to apply rigorously and consistently, even to my own allies. And I haven't seen that. Because under their own logic, Herschel Walker is guilty of murder for hire. And even if you're sorry for that, I don't know how many people would want to elect into the Senate someone who had hired someone to kill a 6-year-old, even if they said they were sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. That is, I mean, that's true. So his argument is, well, because we believe as abortion abolitionists, something about Herschel Walker, we should allow Raphael Warnock, who is who's signing into law bills that are doing the exact same thing that Herschel Walker's being accused of. We should vote for him. All right. I thought about it some more, and that whole Herschel Walker jab that he did was so ungodly. It's really gross, because Herschel Walker is a professing Christian, and he's not living a life of repetitive, consistent abortion or murder for hire, as he wanted to say. However, Raphael Warnock is allegedly a pastor who is pro-choice. He doesn't want any kind of restrictions on abortion. Now, we don't know if Raphael Warnock has been involved in an abortion. I can't assume that he has, but I mean, come on, let's just be honest. If we want to do that with Herschel, then we got to do that with Raphael. And guess what? Herschel Walker is a professing Christian, and outside of this, there's nothing else that shows that he's not. Raphael Warnock doesn't show that he's a Christian, but David French gave cover to him. So in the beginning, when I said that these guys give cover to sin, this is what I'm talking about.
Okay, so we keep saying we're wrapping up, but there's so much to talk about here. I mean, the central argument from the abolitionist point of view is that the rest of the pro-life movement is being hypocritical, because they're claiming that this unborn child is a person, and they're saying, fine, then let's full protection under the law, murder prosecution, all that sort of stuff. You're pointing out the hypocrisy on their side. But this brings up for me, this is going to get me in some trouble probably, but it brings up for me the central dilemma of the entire abortion debate. And that is, I don't want there to be any abortions. And I want to take a pragmatic approach to what is all the things you mentioned, the Romney provision, these other things, paid family leave, that have been proven to alleviate the circumstances that lead many women to choose abortions. I'm all for that. But I heard an ethicist, pro-choice ethicist, make this case, and I found it disturbingly compelling. And she said, imagine there's a hospital, and there's a massive fire in the hospital, and in one room, there is an infant newborn child. And in another room, there is, I don't know the number, 10 embryos that are fertilized. They have 23 chromosomes each. They are genetically human, and you can only save either the 10 test tubes or the newborn child. Under the logic of the abolitionist point of view, you should save the 10 embryos, not the newborn child. And yet everything in me wants to go and save that newborn child.
No, that's a false dichotomy. No, because the newborn child is already either one. You're not. If there's a fire in the hospital, Sky Jahani, I know you know better than this. If there was a fire in the hospital, unless you started it, you're not. I mean, you're doing your very best. So you would, if you saved the 10, you did your best. If you saved the 1, you did your best. If you saved 1 and 3, whatever you did your best. Unless you're not culpable because you did your best. If you did nothing, that would be negligence. So no, that's a silly argument. I'm sorry that that person said that to you and moved you in your heart. There was no reason to, because that was just a silly argument.
If I had to make the choice. And that's the hypocrisy that's kind of built into this whole thing. And even as you pointed out with the Herschel Walker example, like if they're really consistent, they shouldn't vote for him because they should believe that him funding an abortion is no different than him funding the murder of a 6-year-old. But they're even inconsistent on that because there's something just in us that intrinsically sees a difference or acknowledges some difference between a child who's born or an older person and an embryo. And I don't know what to do with that, just practical reality.
Be consistent.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of emotional, psychological complexity built into that.
Right.
You could do a different kind of analysis that says there's a fire and in one room is your wife and in another room are 10 women that you've never met before in your life.
Right.
Who are you going to save? Right. And, you know, in that circumstance,
That's
everything in you, every last fiber of molecule in your body is saying, save your wife that you know. You have to do that. You can't abandon your own wife. And so some of these kind of...
That's just a silly, I'm so sorry. That is a dumb analogy. That's a dumb, I don't know what you, scenario. That's just not a smart one. You're going to take care of your wife because you're commanded to by God. Husbands, love your wives. Care for your wife, man. Take care of your wife. You didn't do anything wrong. You did your best. Now, if you can get your wife out and then you could run back in and try to get another woman out, then that's fine. Or get the embryos out, that's fine. But your responsibility is to your bride. Why are we having this discussion?
Hypothetical games, I think, are of limited utility.
They are. Yeah, I'm not saying you base law and policy on them.
Right, exactly. So a lot of these, a lot of this can be explained by, well, I can interact with the baby. You sort of know the baby. And the test tube becomes theoretical in the sense of the 10 people you don't know in the next room versus your wife. So a lot of these kinds of hypotheticals, I used to be kind of annoying in law school because I really rejected a lot of these arguments based on hypotheticals that are not real world.
Thank you.
And they're not based on foreseeable situations in real life. Although they can be of some use to sort of like press the limits of your intellectual position, I think they're very limited utility when you're talking about how do you make real world kind of decisions. But it is a question that I think highlights a reality that we do have a very different psychological, emotional reaction to a 6-month-old baby than you do to, say, 10 fertilized eggs, right? You do. And I've never met somebody who wouldn't have a very different psychological, emotional reaction to a 6-month-old baby versus 10 fertilized eggs. I've never met that person. And what does that mean is worth thinking through intentionally and seriously and philosophically.
Right.
Nobody is saying that is not the case. For the life of me, I don't know what that whole argument was. The one baby, the 10 babies, the one wife, the 10 women. I have no idea what that was for, because they're not exercises in reality. They are hypotheticals that are not necessarily going to pan out into real world scenarios and such like that. I think the discussion about Herschel Walker was a good one, but hey, like we got to make sure we get the full orb of the discussion. And Mr. Warnock is not spotless either. So yeah, you're right. I mean, abolitionists do have to wrestle with that, and that's fine. But y'all pro-choicers got to wrestle with some things too. All right, so that was the end of French Fry Day with David French. I wanted to go through the entire thing, and I wanted you to hear the entire thing. And I just want you to, did you notice that they didn't talk about Jesus Christ? They didn't talk about the gospel. Realize that 2 Christians argued about the right and wrongness of murdering babies, and they didn't talk about the gospel, God's law, God's provisions, what God has commanded us to do. Nothing. Nope. Just stuck 100% with the legalese and the such like that. And notice they made no progress. They made no progress at all. That argument was exactly in the exact same spot. It was a car sitting on bricks with no gas and no engine. They didn't bring in the gospel. They didn't bring in what does God say about this issue. So it was stuck in the discussion of, man, our flawed reasoning into such like that. Because going back to the whole, one baby, a 6-month-old baby and 10 babies in utero. Well, guess what? Going back using that same logic. Well, Herschel Walker is not having any other babies murdered, whereas Raphael Warnock is still going to be murdering them wholesale. So which one is it better? There you go. I think it's just horrible. It's horrible. And let's just be honest. Let's just be honest. Did you know that was a Christian conversation? Would you have said this is a Christian conversation, and I can tell this is a Christian conversation? Did you say that to yourself? I saw nothing in there that would have been starkly different from any talking head show on any weekend. What was different? I don't think there was anything. I don't think there was one thing different that really stood out as like, oh, this is a Christian conversation. It wasn't. The gospel didn't make an appearance. The gospel doesn't change people's hearts, doesn't deal with the sinful nature of man or woman to want to get away with something without paying a consequence and so forth. Nothing. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for your support, dear Woke Christian. I'll see you next time.